Okay, this is the first of several modules dealing specifically with photosynthesis. And this, what I have written here, is what we refer to as the chemical reaction for photosynthesis. This is the overall reaction. Now, there are many, many reactions that must occur for photosynthesis to go to its completion. But if we boil them all down to the essence of photosynthesis, this is what we end up with. And so we would describe this as saying 6 molecules of CO2, which is carbon dioxide, plus 6 molecules of H2O would yield, and this is called a yield arrow when we write a chemical reaction. It yields 6 molecules of O2 and 1 molecule of this C6H12O6 stuff. So let's talk about each of these individual components of photosynthesis. We'll start talking about CO2 first. This means 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and this CO2 comes from the air. And so plants get all that they need from the air. The air that we breathe has CO2 in it, a small percentage. The air that we exhale has a greater percentage of CO2 in it, and this adds to the CO2 that's naturally found in the atmosphere. So that's where plants get it from. H2O is, of course, water, and plants get all the water they need from the soil through the use of roots in most cases. Now, when we write a chemical reaction on the yield arrow, if there are any specific conditions or any additional criteria that must be present for this reaction to occur, we often make note of it on either side of the reaction arrow. And so one of the things that is required by photosynthesis, of course, is light. And so I'm going to write light in on the top of this arrow. There are various components of a cell that, specifically the chloroplast, that must be present that we'll get into in a few minutes. But in general, I'm just going to put PS for photosynthesis, and that would include all the pigments and other components of a chloroplast that are necessary for this to be carried out. So on this side of the arrow, we would say we have what are known as the reactants. And the reactants are present before the reaction takes place. And so the CO2 is in the air, the water's from the soil. Let's talk about what happens on the right side of this reaction, which we refer to as the products. And the first product is 6 molecules of O2, which is oxygen gas. And this returns to the air, fortunately for us, because this is the sole source of the air that we breathe. Without this oxygen that plants produce, we wouldn't be able to survive. All of the oxygen that gets produced by plants originates in a water molecule. That's where the oxygen ends up. Now, this next molecule here, the C6H12O6, is glucose, which is one of the simple sugars. Basically, this is the stuff that photosynthesis is all about. Plants go through all of the process of photosynthesis specifically to make glucose. Glucose is what fuels the rest of their growth and what allows plants to do work, basically, in a particular cell. And for that matter, this glucose down the line will eventually fuel our own metabolic processes as it gets consumed in the process called respiration, which we'll be covering later in the course as well. Reactants are CO2 and water, and the products, and let me go ahead and write that in, the products of photosynthesis are O2 and sugar. And so this is an important concept to be familiar with, the reactants and the products of photosynthesis. In order to discuss photosynthesis from the ground up, or from its starting point, we have to talk about light in terms of what is light and how does light behave. And to understand that, we need to talk about light and its nature in terms of how it behaves in the form of waves and how it behaves in the form of particles that we would call photons. Light behaves in waves for the most part, and what that means is that it comes in waves, so to speak, of energy. Now, we can think of light as in this form, or we can think of at each peak of this wave, a package of light energy bombards whatever surface it is that it is headed towards. And so If we're thinking of light in these terms, we would refer to each package of energy as a photon. If we're referring to light in this form, we would refer to it as a wavelength. Now, the intensity of light depends on how many photons in a given period of time are striking a surface, or in terms of energy, depends on how far apart the peaks of these waves are. And that is what we refer to as a wavelength. For this particular light here, I'm going to use red here for a second. This distance from peak to peak is what we would call the wavelength. Wavelength is often abbreviated with the Greek letter lambda, and that's shorthand for wavelength, basically. Now, not all light is useful to plants for photosynthesis. There are only certain types of wavelengths that plants are actually interested in. And so if we look at all of the visible light spectrum, it looks like this. This represents the visible spectrum of light, or light wavelengths, that we can see with our eyesight. For different animals, this spectrum may be much smaller. It may be even wider. In the case of insects, for example, it's a little bit wider than this. But basically, on this end of the spectrum, we find these violet colors or purple colors, and they are found in wavelengths of about 390 nanometers. And a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter, and so that's pretty small. Now, over here on the red end of the spectrum is light that is found in the neighborhood of 780 nanometers. And so this is a longer wavelength on this side of the spectrum, and this is shorter on the purple end of the spectrum. However, when we refer back to our discussion a second ago of wavelength and how a shorter wavelength would mean that there are more photons in a given period of time involved, and so shorter wavelength light is, we would say, higher energy light, and longer wavelength light is light of lower energy. And an easy way to remember this is you can think of light beyond this part of the spectrum over in here would be IR, which is short for infrared light, which is the sort of light that you might have seen night vision goggles. That's the sort of thing that they detect, and that's beyond our normal range of vision. On the purple end of the spectrum, we have what are called UV wavelengths, ultraviolet wavelengths, which, although they are not visible to our eyes, because they're high in energy, they are potentially damaging. And I'm sure everybody's familiar now that UV light is potentially damaging to your skin, and that's why we wear sunglasses to protect our eyes, or we wear sunblock to protect our skin. So you can just think of UV versus infrared, and everything in between is visible light. Well, like I said a few minutes ago, plants are only interested in certain parts of this spectrum. So let's talk about what parts they might be interested in. First thing to think about is, what color are plants? Well, in general, we think of plant leaves being green. Go ahead and I'll draw in a little leaf here. So there is our green leaf. We perceive plants to be green because what is actually going on is they're absorbing most of the spectrum that comes in from sunlight, and the waves that they reflect are the waves that they're not actually absorbing and putting to work in photosynthesis. And so we perceive leaves to be green because the light in this part of the spectrum, when it comes to leaves, is for the most part going to be light that is reflected. And so let me say reflected. So the light that's reflected from those leaves, when it hits our eyes, we interpret it as the color green. And that's a little bit difficult for some people to get an understanding of. Just think of whatever something appears to be, it appears that color because that's the color that's reflected to our eyes that we perceive it as being. This means that most of the light that plants use for photosynthesis is not in the green part of the spectrum. In fact, for the most part, it is in this blue to violet part of the spectrum and in the red part of the spectrum. Now, plants absorb these particular parts of the spectrum because of the pigments that they have. And there are many different types of pigments, but the primary pigment that plants use are called chlorophylls, with two L's. And as it says in your notes, chlorophylls are blue-green to yellow-green in color, and so we're talking this part of the spectrum again. And these are by far the most abundant pigment in the leaves, and so leaves predominantly tend to be green in color. Now, these pigments are found specifically in chloroplasts, which we've talked about before, and there are various types. Different types of chlorophyll absorb different wavelengths. There's lambda for wavelengths. For the most part, they absorb blue and red. So I'm going to say mostly blue and red light. Chlorophylls by far, again, are the workhorses of the plant's leaves, of the chloroplast within the leaf cells. There are additional pigments, however, and they're referred to as xanthophylls and carotenoids. Making a little heading here, shift down a hair here. And the xanthophylls tend to be yellow, and the carotenoids, as you may have heard of, carotenoids or beta carotene found in carrots, which happen to be orange, and things that are orange in the plant world anyway tend to have lots of these carotenoid pigments in them. These are also found in chloroplasts, and their job, although they're not as abundant as the green chlorophylls, their job is to help funnel light energy, we'll say, to the chlorophylls themselves. In a nutshell, these three main types of pigments are absorbing at different wavelengths here. And when we add them up together, rather than just having one type of pigment, when we add the various types of chlorophylls, which are absorbing mostly from blue to violet into the blue-green part of the spectrum, and in this over here in this red part of the spectrum, and then we add to that the yellow and the orange pigments, that further expands the wavelengths that the photosynthetic pigments can absorb. And so all together it covers more of the visible spectrum, so that pretty much this region is covered very well. And so when we start getting into the orange or into the true red part of the spectrum, it is covered very thoroughly as well. And so again, this region gets reflected, and that's why leaves appear to be green or greenish yellow or somewhere close to green as far as the spectrum is concerned. A final point to make about these pigments is, within a leaf, these pigments are very numerous, and they tend to be clustered inside a chloroplast into groups, and these groups are called photosynthetic units, and they're just groups of hundreds and hundreds of chlorophyll pigments and also some xanthophylls and carotenoids mixed in.